Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. This is our March edition of PACO's monthly meeting. I'm Teresa Scharf. I'm president of the organization this year, and I'd like to welcome you. For those of you who are arriving, please check your name on the sign-in sheet and select a lunch. There's bottled water here. There are soft drinks out on the CBA counter, so select what you prefer and sit down and enjoy. I just have a few short announcements. First of all, welcome to those who are physically here. Welcome to those who are attending remotely. I know we have at one location there are 8 or 9 paralegals who are out of town, and they are joining us remotely. So we are excited about that and hope that you are as well. We're gaining some momentum and getting our meetings back together, and hope that you are enjoying the opportunities that we have for you, as well as the evening mixers that we've had. We will be doing that again. Just to let you know, a couple things. I trust that you've been reading the weekly message that comes out on Thursday via the listserv, but we are also publishing it on PACO's homepage. So if you missed it, or if it went to your junk folder and you thought, oh gee, I didn't get a message this week, go to PACO's homepage and you will find that message there. That's an alternate way for you to keep up with what we're doing and what our plans are. We will be having a monthly meeting again next month in April. The date is April 9th. We selected that date because that was the date, like today, that there was space available here at the Columbus Bar Association. So be looking for more announcements about the CBA meeting, the PACO meetings we'll be having here at the CBA. And if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me or one of the other officers, Andrea Enderly, who is our vice president, Emily Kwok, who's our assistant vice president, Jamie Warner is our treasurer, and Garth Robotham is our secretary and archivist. He is usually here taking photographs. I imagine he's on his way. A couple of other things I want to bring to your attention. Special thanks once again to Anderson Reporting for the great job that they're doing and the service that they're providing by live streaming these meetings and then posting them on YouTube so you can look at them later. We are contemplating putting them on the website as well for people to look at a later date if they wish. And then also an extra special thanks and shout out to Jeff Cremines at Encore Process Servers. I personally use Jeff and Encore anytime I need a process server. They are just absolutely great, and they have provided lunch for you today. So we want to give a shout out to them and thank them so much for all of their support. And just to give you an idea, for those of you who are familiar with our PACO LASC Pro Bono Wills Clinic effort that we do every month, every time we need paper, because you know you can't print a will and a power of attorney and all of that without paper. Every time we need paper, I just send Jeff an email and he has a case of paper delivered to me. So Jeff has been super supportive of our organization and the efforts that we make to serve the community, and I just want to give him an extra shout today. Be sure to check PACO's Facebook page. We do try to keep up with that and put announcements on there. One was placed on there yesterday about a new sustaining member, and so if you want to take a look and see what there is to offer with some of our sustaining members, that would be great. And if you have any suggestions, any comments, any feedback, we would love to hear from you. This is a member organization. This is not a board organization that you guys come to just to spend an hour with us. This is a member organization. We would love to have more of your involvement and your support. We have committees that we could use you on. We have a couple of committees that are sitting vacant, that have nobody running them right now, that we could use some extra help. We have other committees that are very active, like the Wills Clinic Project. And I will say, for those of you who are already familiar with the Wills Clinic Project and have taken the CLE that is a mandatory requirement before volunteering at one, we have a Wills Clinic coming up this Thursday evening in the north end of Delaware. So if you are available and would like to live in the Delaware County area and it's convenient for you and you have already taken the CLE, we would love to have you join us. I could use a couple more paralegals, and we'll see how the week unfolds here as I send out my final email to all of our volunteers tonight. I would like to introduce to you our guest speaker today. His name is Don McTigue, and he has concentrated in the field of election and campaign finance law for nearly 3 decades. So we're looking forward to hearing the information that he has to share with us to kind of give us some insight about what we all as American citizens should already know and should have learned in 8th grade civics class, but don't practice or don't think about and don't exercise on a normal basis, right? So we're privileged to have Don come and speak to us and share with us. Please give him your attention and be sure to ask questions, and we just welcome him and thank him so much for coming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Teresa. And also, is it Kimeli? Kimeli, sorry. I knew I would mess that up. I'm happy to be here today. Quite some time ago, maybe 30 plus years ago, I taught a couple paralegal classes in something called the American Institute of Paralegal Studies. I don't even know if they're still around. We had classes, they had a building downtown which has been torn down since, but and then they went out to Ohio Dominican University, which was nice teaching out there. So I appreciate what what paralegals do and the value that they can add to a legal practice. My own legal practice is 35 years. This is my 35th year doing election law, which is sometimes called the new term is political law, but election law is still how most people know it. And I say that, but at the same time, election law has only really existed as a niche practice for about 40 years. Okay, I got into it at the time that it was taking off, at least in Ohio, as an area of legal practice. So my background is I worked in the Secretary of State's office as an election attorney under Sherrod Brown when he was Secretary of State. Now, of course, he's U.S. Senator. I was there 8 years. I was the first lawyer hired and the last one to leave. Worked for 3 weeks for Bob Taft when he came in. He had defeated Sherrod's second re-election campaign, and they asked me to stay on during the transition. So the benefit of that is I get to say that I have worked for a Democrat and a Republican Secretary of State. I'm just so bipartisan. Not really. Election lawyers, just like election pollsters and campaign consultants, work for one side or the other. No rational reason except trust. Okay? One side doesn't trust you or won't trust you if you work for the other side. There is an exception, though. I do and am currently representing a Republican running for a high-profile office against another Republican. So I will represent Republicans against Republicans, but never against Democrats. But that's the nature of the practice. So election law kind of breaks down into 3 major areas. One would be compliance, and about 50% of what we do is compliance. So what do I mean by that? Primarily, we're talking about campaign finance, compliance, and to a lesser extent, campaign practices. So we all know what campaign finance is. Campaign practices are things like What are the technical requirements for the disclaimers you have to have on your ads? What are the rules regarding ads? That sort of, what are you allowed to say and do in a campaign? Campaign finances, what are you allowed to do in terms of raising money and spending money? So a lot of the work is campaign finance compliance, or to a lesser extent, campaign practice compliance. The second major area would be ballot access. And half the time, what that means is trying to deny somebody ballot access, the other half the time trying to get some ballot access for someone. And a lot of that is not just candidates, but probably about a third of our ballot access work is ballot issues. Statewide ballot issues and local ballot issues, but primarily statewide ballot issues. The third major area of practice for election law would be voting rights. And Ohio has seen its fair share of litigation around voting rights. 2 years ago, in the presidential election, there were four lawsuits in federal court over voting rights. Today I can talk about the practice of election law. We can also then talk about politics, right, which is a little more fun to talk about. But what I can say right now, where the two kind of blend together, is what I just mentioned about last year. There were 4 lawsuits involving voting rights. I was involved in 3 of those suits. We won all 3 of those suits, including one before a Republican-appointed federal judge. All 3 were overturned quickly by the Court of Appeals. Okay, so that's election law, or is it really election law, or is it politics? Because you have to look at why is the finder of fact overturned in short order by 3 judges on the Court of Appeals. It's because in the Sixth Circuit, we have a disproportionate number of conservative appointees to the court who are less sympathetic to the issue of voting rights. So politics pervades everything. Politics pervades judicial decision processes as well. It's not to say that the courts don't have a legal hook, okay, or some legal analysis to base their decisions on. But politics, and by politics I'm referring to people's political persuasions, philosophical persuasions. I'm not talking about partisan politics, not necessarily. So there are oftentimes 2 ways to view the law, and this is why it's important to get behind electing judges of your choice, that where we can vote for judges, or getting behind electing a president of your choice and a Congress of your choice, or a Senate of your choice at least, because the Senate has to confirm the president's appointments to the federal bench. So politics is so important to the actual practice of election law. Not to mention the fact that election laws change fairly frequently. That might have something to do with who writes the laws, the people who have to run for office, who have to raise money, and then who have to run. So they are interested, people in office are interested in either holding on to power or if they are in a minority, they're looking to expand the base. By the way, I mentioned this to Teresa at the beginning, but I forgot to bring it up. If anybody has a question at any time, feel free to just, raise your hand. Don't have to wait till the end. So in terms of the campaign finance portion, like I said, that constitutes about, campaign finance compliance constitutes maybe about somewhere between a third and a half, maybe, of our practice. We have 4 attorneys and we have 4 support staff. The support staff all do campaign finance reports. So they do the reports for candidates, political action committees, which is why I like your name, has the word PAC in it. Just couldn't let that go. And also ballot issue committees. And we do it at the federal level, the state level, county level, city level, all levels at which candidates run for office or which there can be ballot issues. The rules are different, quite a bit different at each level. Now, for example, most people who run for elected office don't have contribution limits, okay? And that by most, I'm talking school board, township trustees, city councils, county people. Contribution limit, if you look at just in terms of raw number of offices, contribution limits are the exception. You have contribution limits at the federal level for all federal offices. You have it at the state executive level in Ohio, and the General Assembly is included in that, and the state legislative and state executive branches. And then in Ohio, all judicial campaigns, regardless of level, they have contribution limits. And then we get down to county and city and township and board of education. That's pretty much everybody. There's no limits, with one exception. That is, some cities, because we have home rule power, all cities and villages have the ability to enact campaign finance rules for their municipal elections because of the home rule power that cities and villages have in Ohio. So you will see that, and sometimes, for example, Cincinnati, Akron, Cleveland have contribution limits. Locally, Upper Arlington has contribution limits. But in addition to limits on fundraising, there are also additional reporting requirements that can be imposed. Columbus has quite a few additional reporting requirements that only apply to people running for office in the city of Columbus, okay? So for example, in Columbus, you have to include the employer and occupation of every contributor to the campaign, regardless of the amount of the contribution. That's different than state law. State law has a threshold at which that kicks in. In Columbus, it's everybody. In Columbus, you have to also, even though you already are filing copies of your reports with the Board of Elections per state law, you're now required in Columbus to also file them with the clerk of the city of Columbus. And then Columbus enacted some additional reports, so you file more often as well. So we have a fairly intricate grid that we make at the beginning of every year of all of the filing deadlines that apply. This particular year it's more complicated than usual because you have the federal and the statewide offices up for election as well. So in terms of, what paralegals might do, okay? The four people that we have that I refer to as support staff in our office are essentially operating like paralegals, even though it's not a requirement when we hire people. But what they're doing is compliance work, which paralegals have to do a lot of times in other areas. It's filling out forms, campaign finance forms, okay? Just like when you have to fill out templates for whatever area of law you're practicing in. So it's this support work that involves where you have to know what the law is. For example, we train, and by the way, you don't learn this anywhere except by working in my office or one of the other attorneys that do this in the state. And incidentally, there are only 3 attorneys on the Democratic side, and I think you could probably say there are 3 on the Republican side statewide. So this is not exactly, yeah, it's a very specialized area. And there are other attorneys who know this stuff and do a little bit of it, but in terms of attorneys who actually make a living doing it, where it's like their bread and butter, there's about 6 total statewide. But the people that we hire, we say no prior experience required, okay? We do like it if people are, registered voters and, are interested in politics. And we train them on the job. That's where they learn it. And then they are the front line. They're almost like a customer representative in a way, maintaining good relationships with the clients, which are not always just the office holders, but also the campaign staff. And then making sure when we are depositing money, right, we want to make sure that it's money you're allowed to accept in terms of the source. And number 2, that you're not going over the limit. Number 3, that we have all the data that we need to be able to properly report those contributions. And then, so our people in the office are kind of like our front line to make sure that our clients are complying with that. And if there are questions, and there's always new things popping up, they can come talk to one of us, one of the attorneys. But we also depend upon our people on the side of the money going out. A little less complicated, but politicians like to spend money, other people's money, right? It's like it's contributions, and they like to spend money. But there are some rules about what you're allowed to spend campaign funds for. And so this used to be an easier thing to monitor before everybody discovered debit cards. And now the candidates have debit cards. And what we learned quickly was we need to help protect them from themselves by limiting in terms of what they can use it for. And after, I think, a couple instances of them, an office holder pulling out the wrong debit card and putting like a personal expense, like, a haircut or something on their campaign card, we started taking black Sharpies and writing across campaign only, okay? Because these debit cards look like credit cards now, right? They all say MasterCard or Visa on them. So this is how we try to help our clients comply with the law. And then let me talk a little bit about ballot access. As I mentioned, yes?
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
So do you represent all spectrums of all political spectrums there's no ethical rule involved in that, or it doesn't matter?
When we represent, in my firm, we represent Democrats.
Oh,
We will, on occasion, represent a Republican running against a Republican. And quite frankly, the reason for that is because the person we're representing first went to that Republican election lawyer who said, I can't do it because I represent the other Republican. And it's usually the situation where the Republican election lawyer is representing the establishment Republican, right? The endorsed Republican. So that Republican election lawyer will say, but why don't you contact Don McTigue, okay? And in a situation like that, we can represent the Republican against the Republican. But that has its limitations because it's only until the primary is over, because then we're not going to represent a person against the Democrat. And then you also have to calculate whether or not that's going to conflict you out of being able to represent the Democrat. Well, obviously the Democrat hasn't hired me, or for the primary. Otherwise, I would have to say no right off the bat. But that becomes kind of more of a business calculation than anything else. The same with independents, representing an independent. We have represented independents before, and that's a little bit less of an issue in terms of business practice, in terms of a business. What I call it's not really an ethical conflict, but in terms of being a business conflict, okay, it's less of a problem.
so generally attorneys would either represent Democrats or
Yes.
they can't do both.
Uh,
It would make sense, right?
They could do both, but they wouldn't be in business very long.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Yeah. So it's really a practical business consideration. It's not a lawyer's ethics consideration. I mean, the lawyer's ethics issues are the same that they always are. I mean, I had on the Democratic side, I had 4 of the 5 candidates running for governor try to hire me. Okay? I'm not going to work for more than one. Okay? Because I just feel I could ask somebody to waive a conflict, but I'm not even comfortable asking them to waive a conflict. Okay? I just think it's better to pick one, and quite frankly, I usually end up with whoever asked me first. That's kind of just the way I've practiced over the years, and I don't try to play one off. In other words, I never felt good about trying to put somebody on hold while I try to get somebody, who can pay me more. I never felt good about that. So I tend to, if I feel good about the candidate who's asking me to do their work, I'll go with whoever asked me first. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. Ballot access. So this is, I tell you, the most fun for me in terms of ballot access is working on statewide ballot issues. And in Ohio, we're kind of lucky. I'm lucky for me as an election lawyer, and I think lucky for the citizens in that we have a relatively good process, or I don't want to say it's easy, but we have a process that is not insurmountable for being able to place issues on the ballot, whether they're to amend the Constitution or to amend a city charter. Okay? Ohio has we're nowhere near states like California, but you have to keep in mind, first of all, that less than half of the 50 states actually have citizen initiative and referendum. Okay? What we can do here in Ohio in terms of citizens circulating a petition, to amend the Constitution, or short of amending the Constitution, to propose a law to the General Assembly, which they have to consider, but, if they don't pass it, then you can get it on the ballot. That right doesn't exist in about half of the states, but it does in Ohio. And it is part of the whole right of initiative and referendum comes about as a result of what's known as the progressive era in American politics, which would have been around the turn of the century, the previous century. So in the early 1900s, right? Right at the beginning, essentially in the first decade of the 1900s, there was widespread citizen-generated reform movements across the country against two things: against corporate control of state offices and the state legislature, and also what they called the backroom, the smoke-filled backroom method of political bosses choosing the candidates. So the only people you got to vote for were the ones that the head of the party put on the ballot. Okay, so the reform movement, Ohio wasn't the only state, but a lot of other states amended their constitutions. Ohio did it in 1912 to provide for citizen initiative and referendum, and also to provide that all candidates had to be nominated, in terms of political party candidates, had to be nominated through a primary election that anybody could file for. Okay, so that took power out of the hands of political bosses, and it also, as a result, we have a lot more candidates who run, but we also have the initiative and referendum. So Ohio, in terms of the states that have initiative and referendum, Ohio is about in the middle in terms of how hard it is, how easy it is to make the ballot. We do have, our requirement is for 10% of the last gubernatorial vote. If you want to propose a constitutional amendment, you have to have a petition. There are a bunch of technical requirements, but the bottom line is you got to get the signatures, and you can place a proposed constitutional amendment on the ballot. And we have the indirect method of proposing laws to the General Assembly, where you have to get signatures equal to 3% of the gubernatorial vote. General Assembly gets your proposed law. They have 4 months to do something. They usually don't do anything. They usually just kind of sit on their hands. Then you file another 3% to get it on the ballot. So now that's proposing a state statute. Okay. The state statute process isn't used very often. Okay. In part because it's a more drawn out timeline for trying to get something to the ballot. These can only go on in November elections. And so with a proposed statute, you have to start the year before, okay, in order to, the initial petition that you file has to be filed, it's always right around Christmas time, okay, that you have to file that to get the proposed law to the General Assembly, which means you basically had to start several months before that collecting your signatures. So it's a very drawn-out process. The constitutional amendment process has been much more popular because you can collect, even though you have to have 10 signatures equal to 10% as opposed to a total of 6, these ballot proposals, whether it's a statute or a constitutional amendment, are almost always well-funded by somebody, okay? And so collecting the additional signatures isn't as important as being able to move more quickly to get things onto the ballot. Now, we've seen an increase in the number of proposals being submitted to voters over the last, I don't know, decade, maybe longer, let's say the last 20 years. There is a single reason for that. And when I say single, there's one reason, and that is because of how polarized things have become at the General Assembly, right? So it used to be, and this is all, and that all goes back to gerrymandering, okay? So when districts were not so egregiously gerrymandered, you had more competitive districts, okay? You might still have, say, a Republican majority in the House and maybe a Republican majority in the Senate, okay? But you had smaller majorities. And so people were willing, in the General Assembly, people would be more willing to compromise because you'd have, they would need, to trade votes, right? And you have more people you can trade votes with and reach a compromise to pass legislation. But even more fundamental than having more balance in terms of the numbers of Democrats and Republicans is the types of Democrats and Republicans. Because with gerrymandered districts, winning the primary is what matters. The general doesn't matter. The general election doesn't matter. It's winning the primary, okay? Because it's gerrymandered for the general election, okay? So a Republican, if it's gerrymandered Republican, the Republican whoever the Republican candidate is, unless you're like Roy Moore, okay, and have those issues, no matter who the Republican candidate is that comes out of the primary, they're going to win the general election, okay? So what they have to do is they got to win the primary. Well, the people who vote in the primary are just a small part of who votes in the general, okay? Remember, you're going to win this. You're going to win this. What you got to do is you got to win this, okay, at the primary. And those are the diehards, okay, who vote, in primary elections because they philosophically identify with a party. And of course, things have been evolving in terms of how, there's been competition, say, within the Republican primaries for the hearts and minds of Republican voters, Republican-leaning voters, because not all Republicans or Republican-leaning voters are the same. So they fight out at that stage whether it's going to be a really right-wing Republican or a moderate Republican. There's no more like Rockefellers that were, progressive type Republicans. So they fight out at the primary which political philosophy for the Republican Party, and everything I'm saying is true on the Democratic side too, but we've seen a lot more of this going on within the Republican Party, and basically the very conservative segments of the population that favor Republicans have tended to do much better in mobilizing themselves, okay? Whether it's like around anti-abortion issues or gun rights, they're much more organized, and so they can get out and they can elect the more conservative candidate at the primary, okay? So as a result, that person's going to win the general. So you get then to trying passing legislation, and that person is not going to compromise as much with members of the other party because they have to answer to their base within 2 years. Okay, So, long story short, that is why we have more ballot issues, okay? Because you know, believe me, it's a lot better to try to do it through the legislature if you could do it through the legislature and to compromise the only time that we've seen some compromises come about now is when people have qualified for a statewide issue, and it has very it has provisions that are being proposed that just people can't live with. So all of a sudden, people are willing to talk. Okay, and you have a certain window in which you can withdraw something from the ballot, right? So you have leverage, and that's happened. That happened on a few years ago on Humane Society of the United States brought something, proposed law on essentially caging requirements for that related to various animals, types of animals, farm animals. The legislature said, if you guys can work, and the governor got involved, said, if you guys can work stuff out with the Farm Bureau, we'll pass it. Okay, so that's what happened. Now, having explained all of that, there's also one more thing to say about these initiatives, in that they almost never pass. It's like 9 out of 10 fail, okay? But I'm so pleased that people are still willing to pay me to keep putting them on the ballot, okay? But they're hard to pass. And this comes up within the last 2 years, the General Assembly was looking at proposing amendments to the Constitution to make it even harder to pass these things. They were talking about raising the threshold to 55. Some wanted to go to 60%. In order to amend the Constitution, 60% of the voters had to vote yes. Then ultimately the committee agreed to 55. It's 50. It's 50% plus 1 right now, right? So the argument is, well, why? Why, these almost never pass anyways. Why are you making it even harder, right? And people say it's because, well, we don't want people, we don't think that people should be cluttering up the Constitution with all this detail, okay? For example, we have 4 casinos in Ohio, right? Those casinos are situated on 4 pieces of property made up of various parcels. The legal description for those parcels are in the Constitution, okay? Because that's the only, first of all, the General Assembly is never going to pass, and you didn't have to amend the Constitution to have casinos in Ohio. But the General Assembly wasn't going to pass it. And the people who are going to put money into this effort want to be able to make some money, okay? So they had to control the language and the property. But again, if there had been more willingness to compromise in the General Assembly, we would not have gotten to that stage. Now that's the 1 out of 10 that passed, okay? Because they had plenty of money to promote it, and because it was perhaps the most well-disciplined message campaign that I've ever seen. They always just talked about jobs, right? It was never about, crime or, special interests or addiction, gambling addictions, okay? Those were all kind of addressed a little bit in the amendment, but the advertising was always about jobs, okay? And the fact that Ohio was behind the curve in terms of the neighboring states. All of the neighboring states except one had casinos. So there was that argument about diverting state revenue. So the last thing I'm just going to talk about briefly is the voting rights. Currently, there is actually a voting rights case from Ohio, pending before the U.S. Supreme Court over what's called voter purges, which is purging of voter registrations. I can tell you that of the cases that were brought 2 years ago, I thought this is the case I did not work on, and I thought it had the least chance of winning, of them winning. They actually won at the trial level. Then they got a good draw on their 3 judges in the Court of Appeals, and it got upheld, I think, 2-1. But now it's at the Supreme Court, and who knows? I was surprised that the Supreme Court took the case, but it has to do with really technical interpretations of the federal voting rights law on what you're allowed to do before you can remove somebody's registration. Because what happens is a lot of people only vote every 4 years, okay? And some of them don't even vote every 4 years, okay? So there was a temporary restraining order or preliminary injunction, I don't remember, that was in effect during the presidential election. And the state kept separate track of these, how many additional people got to vote as a result of that, who would not have been qualified to vote because of their registrations being older. And there was something like about 8,000 people, which is not a small number, of people. So we'll see how that turns out from the U.S. Supreme Court. It was argued last month, I believe. So we have a time to wait before we'll have an actual decision. So the one last thing I would say about election law, I haven't used this phrase in a while, but election law or political law is the law of minutia. Okay, now that's true in some other, like price securities law and things like that, when you're doing official statements for underwriting bonds and things. But so many things in politics can result in you not being on the ballot, or result in being referred to the Ohio Elections Commission for a extremely minor issue, campaign finance issue. Okay, but what options? For example, let's say you took a check from a corporation by mistake. It said, Acme Car Wash, right? And you didn't look up to see whether it was incorporated or not. Well, you can't take corporate. So you might get referred to the Ohio Elections Commission, and the commission, you've refunded the money. The commission is going to say, good, and this is like 99% of their cases are violation, but good cause shown not to impose a fine and not to refer for prosecution. So what does that mean? My opponent violated Ohio's election laws. We shouldn't elect my opponent who disregards Ohio election laws and has been found by a bipartisan body of the state of Ohio to have violated election laws. Okay? Everything's blown out of proportion. So you try to pay attention to the minutia on things so that your clients don't face that kind of an ad, or so that they end up not, falling one signature short of what they need to be on the ballot. Okay, any more questions? Yes, sir?
I got kind of it's an old question about Chicago in 1960. I've heard both stories. Well, there was massive election fraud and it affected the presidential election, but I heard read other articles about it being just a local issue.
You're talking about on the presidential?
Yes,
on
Kennedy
the-
versus Nixon.
Yeah. You talking about the election or the convention?
Actually, election in
Election.
1960.
Yeah. 60, I don't know. I really don't. I mean, it's, God, this is one time where I get to say, oh, you know, I was still a young kid. Even though I've been practicing as a lawyer for almost 40 years, okay, be 40 years next year, you know, yeah, that's still, in 1960s, I wasn't paying attention to politics. Yeah.
Me neither. It was
Yeah, and I haven't read up on it.
Nice.
I mean, I think some of the more interesting things were about, you know, what happened in Texas, about, you know, Johnson delivering the state for Kennedy. And, you know, people are pretty well convinced it's, you know, something was done there wrong, so.
There's just a lot of stories about dead people voting in Chicago.
Oh, dead people voting? Yeah, well, you know, yeah. I mean, yeah, that happened, yeah, sure. That, it still happens. In Ohio has, it's something, in terms of number of unlawful people voting, it's not really dead people. That every now and then, there's gonna be a dead person. But it happens, the most recent case I can think of, there's a nun, Catholic nun in Cincinnati, whose Mother Superior had just died. And the absentee ballot had been mailed to the Mother Superior, right? So her friend, right, voted the ballot for her. And you know, she faced a criminal charge as a result, okay? But so it happens, the dead person voting is like almost never happens in Ohio, but it has to be something like that. Nobody really consciously goes out and does it. You know, usually what you have in Ohio in terms of unlawful votes fall into one of two categories. One, the persons are not a U.S. citizen. And quite frankly, I think they sometimes get confused because they have driver's licenses, right? And what do you have to do when you you register to vote? You have to have ID. You fill out your Ohio driver's license that's your ID. What do you have to show when you show up at the polls? Your driver's license, okay? Or some other kind of ID, but the most common one is that, so they vote. So the other category are people who vote in two different like counties at the in the same election, and that's usually a situation of well, I own property in this county, I live in this county, you know, so I figure I'm allowed to. I'm going to vote. I want to vote against that real estate tax, you know, and so people sometimes get confused on that as well. But even including these mistakes that people make, which is not really an intent to commit voter fraud, right? Because you're not going to swing an election with one vote like that, okay? Not usually, although there are cases where things get tied, but you know, Ohio's overall, even including those situations, is something like the amount of unlawful voting is something like 0.00000001. It's very small. You had a question over here, I think somebody. Yeah.
You had mentioned you work at the Secretary of State's office. Is there a lot of movement among election attorneys between public and private sector, or pretty much once you're in one, you're in it?
Well, there aren't a lot of election lawyers in the Secretary of State's office to start with, okay? I mean, you might have 3 or 4, okay? I think that, most of the people who've come out of the Secretary of State's office who were election lawyers never went into practicing election law, okay? You know, for one reason or another. I mean, it's you know, I think I was fortunate in terms of my timing when things were starting to take off. when people thought maybe I should hire an election lawyer, where in the past they would just go to some lawyer who, a lawyer friend, right? And they would do it for free. But what the best thing for business is someone else, the person on the other side, hire an election lawyer, because then you feel you need an election lawyer, right? So that's worked out well. So that's why I do want Republican election lawyers and even some Democratic election lawyers that I can refer people to, and vice versa. So.
Earlier you mentioned about, I think, 3 or 4 lawsuits going on right now, and is it election law?
Yeah, well, there were 4 lawsuits in federal court on voting rights from the presidential election. 3 of them are completely over.
What can you describe what it's
Yeah.
about?
Well, one was on technical requirements for voting absentee or voting provisional ballots. Okay, this is what we have. We have what's called the 5 fields, which is 5 fields of information that you had to fill out, and the General Assembly changed the law to make these fields mandatory, and that any minor mistakes would result in the ballot being thrown out. So we had a trial in front of Judge Marbley 2 years ago, where we produced tons of evidence from around the state showing how these ballots were not being counted because of minor errors. And then we had the elections officials from those counties who all said, we wish we could count these ballots. We know who this person is. We know this is not a fraudulent ballot, okay? But they couldn't count it because the law didn't let them count it, okay? So we won that case on equal protection and First Amendment grounds, and then the Sixth Circuit reversed it. Okay, within a couple of weeks, essentially ignoring the evidence. Then again, that was a 2-to-1 decision up there. We had 2 Republicans and 1 Democrat, and the Democrat wrote a dissenting opinion, which got a lot of play nationally because he had page after page of the history of voting rights and pictures of African Americans who died, and non-African Americans as well, who died to fight for voting rights. So it was, he really took his colleagues to task. So the other case was sort of a kitchen sink attacking a bunch of requirements, like limits on the number of voting machines, things that basically were impeding voting, making it either harder to vote or creating long lines, that sort of thing. And while we lost about half that case at the trial level, we won about half. Then the Court of Appeals, 2-to-1, threw that out. Then the last one, which was and those first 2 were really long trials. One lasted 10 days, one lasted 14 days. The last case was very quick. We went up to get a TRO against the Trump campaign and Roger Stone because they were basically saying how they were encouraging people to show up at the polls on election day, and they would say, and which neighborhoods we're talking about. It was code word for African American neighborhoods, and make sure that they don't steal the election for Hillary, okay? Which was encouraging people to show up outside the polls with, guns, which you're allowed to have outside the polls, and just to harass. So we got a TRO against that activity, which about 4 days later the Sixth Circuit threw out. So, so those are the cases. Now, there are a bunch of other election cases right now at the Ohio Supreme Court that are not voting rights cases, but are more about petition requirements and things like that. One of the interesting things in Ohio, I'll just say quickly, is the Ohio Supreme Court has original jurisdiction on election cases, on most election cases. So when we lose at, say, we lose at the Board of Elections on something, we can either go to Common Pleas, Court of Appeals, or the Ohio Supreme Court. Well, almost everybody just goes to the Supreme Court because, first of all, time is short. This is right before the election. They have a special rule expediting election cases where you got 5 days, 333. That's, from the answer, 3 briefs, and it's submitted for decision. So and there's of course nowhere to appeal after that. And they've developed a certain amount of expertise there as a result of having so many election cases. Yes?
What is the state of gerrymandering in Ohio?
Oh, well, actually, so,
It was a ballot issue.
yeah,
not that long ago.
2015.
Voted down.
Yeah, so it passed. Well, 15 went down, which was something that was put out by the League of Women Voters and some labor organizations. That went down. The General Assembly, though, then, in bipartisan, group, put something on in, I guess, must have been 16, okay? Or maybe it was 17. God, I can't remember now. But just in the last couple of years. So the citizen-initiated one went down in flames because they spent all their money basically to get on the ballot and didn't have any money left to convince people to vote for it. And then the legislature came back because there had been so much public pressure and pressure from, like John Husted was saying, had been saying for years, we got to do something, okay, about gerrymandering. We got to make it more fair. So the newspapers, and there was a lot of national criticism of Ohio. It's like considered the second most gerrymandered state in the country. So the General Assembly put one on the ballot, and that passed either last year or the year before. Now it's going to be on the ballot in May. The one that was in the last 2 years was for the Ohio General Assembly. Now we can have congressional. As you've probably been reading about this, the General Assembly just agreed on a fairly complex process that should reduce gerrymandered districts. That's going to be on in May. But that was a bipartisan effort in the General Assembly. And they wrote the ballot language, they adopted the ballot language for that says, oh, this is going to make elections fairer. Who could vote against it? So everybody will vote. It's great ballot language if you want a yes vote.
On the same subject, what's your thoughts of Pennsylvania?
Well, Pennsylvania is, what's interesting in Pennsylvania is, is that the courts are ruling that the gerrymandered districts violate the state constitution. And it's the state courts that are making that decision. So that's a strategic move by whoever brought that lawsuit. I've done that myself where I will decide I'm not going to put any federal claims in a case. I'm just going to put a state claim in a case because I'd rather take my chances with the state judge than I would with the federal level. So that becomes a very strategic type of decision. Now that involves, of course, just one district, but when you have to change one district, they just bump up, right? You have to, there's it's a bit of a domino effect. By the way, the Ohio, this thing's going to pass in May. There's no question about it. And then we have the one that just passed in the last couple of years. So neither one of these, though, take effect till 2022, okay? Because the census is done in 2020. I keep hitting this microphone up here. The next census is done in 2020. Then you need a year to come up with the new districts, okay, which will then be in effect for 2022. I think that's what I said before, right? So, it's still a bit ways off. It's a bit of a ways off still before we have these new districts and see how it works out. But, it's going to be better than what we have. Yes.
So just one more on the gerrymandering adjustment. Is there some disadvantage to that as far as state representatives go for minority candidates? Is it possible that minority candidates, some may lose their seat?
Yeah, on congressional,
Actually, state representatives.
state, yeah, I don't think so, because you still have to, no matter what you do, to meet the there's new criteria about creating competitive districts, okay? And competitive is based on basically crunching numbers about how the major political parties have done, say, in the previous 10 years, okay? But you still have to comply, first of all, with the Federal Voting Rights Act, because the supremacy clause, right? So you cannot, so under the federal law, you cannot create districts which make it impossible for people of a racial minority, because it's not just African Americans, but that's the largest minority group in Ohio, where you make it impossible for them to elect the candidates of their choice. Now, what's interesting about that is it's not always about them electing someone of the same race. And you get into there's a lot of social science and statistics that goes into those types of voting rights cases. So this is why I don't think it's going to affect the number of minorities that are able to win. Yeah. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Well, thank you again, Mr. McTigue. I think I'll pronounce it correctly this time. Thank you again for coming and speaking. What an interesting topic. I think we could have gone on for another hour or so. You had lots of nuggets to share with us, and we appreciate that so much. We appreciate those of you who came, those who are online. Continue to watch the website and the weekly messages for information about upcoming events. Don't forget also, Paralegal Day is on May 14th. That is a Monday. It is going to be held at the Greystone Winery. You need to really be paying attention for when the information to register is published, because we have limited space to accommodate everyone in this particular venue. So you really want to register pretty quick, and it's going to be pretty economical. I think it's going to be a little bit less expensive for you to attend than it has been in past years. So it certainly won't be more expensive, and I think it's going to be a little bit less. So keep your eyes and ears open for that, and thank you again for coming. This concludes our March meeting. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to contact one of your PACO officers, myself, Kemily, Andrea, Jamie, or Garth. Thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone.